So next up, we'd like to welcome Dr. Brian Galla from the University of Pittsburgh. Brian is a research scientist in the psychology and education, and again, making connections. Another researcher, David Creswell at CMU, connected us a couple years ago, and Brian was involved in a study that we did along with Penn State on school climate here last year. So please welcome another friend, Brian Galla.
Good morning, everyone. Let's try that again. Can you all hear me? Good? Testing. 1, 2, 3. It's really still a little feedback, huh? Okay. It's really an honor to be here this morning, and thank you all for your attendance. I'm also really excited to be able to share some research that I've been doing over the last couple of years, looking at the relationship between mindfulness and how this capacity might boost self-regulation in adolescents and young adults. So the talk today is going to have 3 main sections. I think I have about 25 minutes or so. And in the first 2 sections, I want to provide a brief theoretical and almost philosophical overview of these topics, particularly because I think mindfulness is deeply misunderstood in our culture, and so I wanted to try to help us understand that together. And then in the third part, I'd like to talk about just some results from research studies that we, my colleagues and I here in Pittsburgh, have been conducting. In my early 20s, I started meditating. I started practicing mindfulness quite intensively. I went on extended periods of silent retreat. And I did this many years before I ended up going back to get a PhD in educational psychology. This was when I was also working in high schools. And what's been really interesting now as a scientist who studies mindfulness and meditation, to see the differentiation between mindfulness as a construct in Western psychological science and mindfulness in the contemplative traditions in which I started my own practice. And so, to be perfectly frank, the connection to Buddhism in the scientific literature is acknowledged to some degree, but what's often not discussed, at least in any consistent way, is the kind of theoretical scaffolding upon which mindfulness rests. It's never been really easy for me to understand on its face how just something like mindfulness could be therapeutic. And so what I'd like to do in this first section is reintroduce some of this historical context, because I think it can help demystify this idea of mindfulness, but I think it also importantly reconnects it to its intended purpose, and it helps us understand why it might actually be therapeutic in the first place. So let's begin. To be human is to suffer. This is a bedrock view of the Buddhist understanding of the human condition. We all have to experience aging, we all have to get old, we all get sick, and eventually we're all going to have to confront death. These are inescapable realities for all of us. But on a more mundane level, we have to deal with things that we just don't like. My back hurts a lot. We get corn stuck in our teeth, right? This shirt looked a whole lot better like in the store than when I put it on, right? And we also have to be separated from the things that feel good. Summer vacation comes to an end every year, it seems. That really delicious food that we've been longing to eat kind of loses its excitement after a few bites, right? This understanding, right, this truth of the dissatisfaction of the human condition is the starting point in this framework. Thankfully, it doesn't end here, but it's important to acknowledge this from the beginning. Importantly, there is this idea that we react to this condition and that our reactivity is the source of a lot of our discomfort and our stress, right? This term reactivity is sometimes seen as a translation of the Pali word tanha, which can be directly translated as thirst. Sometimes it's translated also as craving, and sometimes I like to use this jargony term, affective reactivity, for reasons that will become clearer in a moment. But the idea here is not just, I'm thirsty, I'm going to take a drink. It is an unquenchable, habitual inclination to grasp pleasure and also to be separated from any kind of discomfort, right? And it's this deeply rooted reaction, almost on a moment-to-moment experience that pervades our lives, that can be seen as the source of a lot of additional distress. And so how does this reactivity arise? So the idea here, according to this framework, is that sensory information is registered through the senses, and this gives rise to a feeling tone, an affective tone. Things feel good or they feel bad, right? And then in response to this feeling, we have reactivity, right? We cling to things that feel good and want them to last forever, and we push away things that feel bad and we want them to go away immediately. And that this in turn conditions an action. If this was just a one-off thing, it would be fine, right? If we shift our position in the seat, we alleviate discomfort and we feel better. The problem, according to this view, is that our actions are reinforced so that similar situations in the future give rise to similar feelings, we react in similar ways, and we act, right? And we can find ourselves locked in this cyclical pattern that becomes very entrenched, and it's very hard to extricate ourselves from. Maybe in a more concrete example here, you can see how affective reactivity to the unpleasant feeling that arises in response to getting critical feedback, right? This reactivity could lead to negative emotions, negative self-evaluations, negative thoughts that not only further escalate feeling bad, but that lead to an action, right? The student is going to disengage from this. And it feels good. The student has disengaged from something that feels bad. The problem, however, is that it limits the learning that can actually be attained from taking in the critical feedback. And maybe even more troublesome is that students who do this might unwittingly lock themselves into a cycle of reactivity. So that over time, this could harden into negative views of physics, in this example, could harden into negative self-concepts about their own ability to succeed, and so forth. But there's a way through. The idea is that our reactivity is the fulcrum upon which our distress rests. If we increase craving and reactivity, we increase distress, and if we reduce craving and reactivity, we reduce stress. We cut it off at the source. We learn to interrupt the habitual tendency to react to our feelings, right? We learn to decouple the experience of feeling bad with needing it to go away immediately, right? We learn to hold pleasant experiences without grasping them and wanting them to last forever. And here is where mindfulness is seen as an important component for understanding and ultimately undercutting this cycle of reactivity. And so what is mindfulness? There are two more or less compatible views that we can talk about. On the one hand, there is this Western psychological view, which more or less uses mindfulness as involving two different kinds of components. The first is this attention to the present moment and an attitude of curiosity and receptivity to whatever arises in the frame of attention. The other more kind of classical or contemplative view of mindfulness derives from, again, the Pali word sati, which means to remember, memory. So here the cognitive dimension of mindfulness becomes a bit more clear, right? Yes, in terms of helping to remember prior events, mindfulness is helpful, but it's also seen as an analog of working memory. Mindfulness functions to hold information in mind. It's our mind's natural capacity to bring things into conscious awareness and hold them there without distraction so that we can observe them. And we do this, we practice things like meditation and yoga to cultivate this quality of mindfulness so that we can form almost a stable mental space so that we can observe at a very clear moment-to-moment basis what's happening. And we begin to see that our minds react, right? We begin to notice how we habitually try to push away discomfort and how we habitually try to cling to pleasure. And then we can also become more attentive to how these tendencies lead us to act in certain ways and sometimes actually perpetuate our distress. But we can also become aware of when our minds are not filled with reactivity, that they're contented and that we can act in different ways. And through this investigation, we can develop insight. We can notice that all of our feelings arise and they pass away, right? That we don't have to cling to anything. And by this kind of dispassionate observation of experience, we can, quote, de-automate from our conditioned reactions, right? As opposed to reacting, we can now open up the range of skills and strategies that we can bring to bear on a problem that might be more consistent with our values and our goals. There's a saying that goes, we've opened up a degree of freedom over our behavior, right? We go from a position of rigidity to one of flexibility that arises in this moment-to-moment development of mindfulness. And so now I want to turn attention with that in that framework in mind to understanding some of the studies that we've been doing with adolescents. We ask ourselves, what would this look like in a 15-year-old and a 16-year-old? What would the expression of non-reactivity do in an adolescent's life? And I use the word or the term self-regulation to really just denote a lot of the things that Mark had talked about earlier is goal-directed action, right? We know that temptations get in the way of our goals, so it would involve self-control, being able to resist temptations. We know that stress and powerful emotions can get in the way of our goals, and so it also involves emotion regulation. Might this quality of mind be helpful for adolescents? And in the first study that I want to talk about, we asked the question, if mindfulness is just a naturally occurring quality of minds, then might we just naturally see this express itself in the everyday life, right? And we wanted to understand if mindfulness also just naturally develops during adolescence, right? We know that adolescence is a period of profound change and learning and reorganization of brain regions that serve a lot of different social and emotional processes. And so we might understand also that mindfulness would change during adolescence. And if it does change, does it naturally confer resilience? And we focused here on the transition to high school because this can be a challenging time for a lot of youth. And so this data for this study were taken from a large longitudinal study of about 1,600 middle school students from across the United States. And they filled out surveys once every 6 months for 2 years. And we asked them questions about mindfulness, this ability to become aware of negative experiences, but without getting lost in them, without getting overtaken by them. We also asked them to report on their stress in their daily life, the degree to which their life demands were overwhelming and unpredictable. And then we also asked about positive experiences. Did you experience joy and happiness and satisfaction in the last month? The first thing that we found that was interesting to us was that mindfulness increases across time. In the absence of training, adolescents mature in their capacity for mindfulness. I think this is a really important finding because it demystifies mindfulness as some kind of special thing that only some people have, right? This is a natural tendency of the mind, and it seems to mature like many other qualities of mind during adolescence. And then here's just a rendering of a statistical model. Aside from being an awesome tattoo, if any of you are thinking about getting some new ink recently, I want to draw your attention to the red arrows. And so what you can see is that mindfulness was negatively related to stress. And so what this means is that adolescents who were improving, just naturally increasing in their capacity for mindfulness, were reporting less stress in their lives 6 months later. Right? Their lives were less overwhelming in their eyes. And likewise with positive affect, again, maybe you can focus on those red arrows. There was a positive association between mindfulness and positive emotions, so that teens who increased in their capacity for mindfulness reported more joy and satisfaction in their lives 6 months later. And so just to quickly summarize the results of this study, we found that from 8th to 9th grade, adolescents naturally mature in this quality to become aware of, but take a step back from difficult experiences. And that students who matured the most in this capacity reported less stress and more positive experiences. In other words, less reactivity, less stress, right? And this occurred during a rather stressful time for a lot of adolescents, so it could suggest an opportune time to help boost this capacity, to maybe foster resilience as well. And so now we can ask the question, all right, we found in this just natural longitudinal study that mindfulness was beneficial. What if we train mindfulness directly in teens? What effects might that have? Might it help boost self-control? Might it help boost emotion regulation and cognitive function? This was the next study that I want to talk about. And here, this was a collaboration that was done with Inward Bound Mindfulness Education. For those of you who are going to go attend Doug Worthen's afternoon session, he'll talk a lot about IBME and the work that they do. They are a national nonprofit, and they deliver mindfulness training to teens. Their primary export are these week-long mindfulness retreats. And they're modeled after retreats for adults, in that the whole point of it is to cultivate moment-to-moment attention, moment-to-moment mindfulness. There's no cell phones, there's no internet during these experiences, and about half the day is spent in silent meditation. The other half of the day is spent practicing mindfulness in community with their peers and with the teaching staff. And so these teens are engaging in about 4 to 5 hours of silent meditation every day for a week. You can imagine what they say after something like this, right? The teens who go on these retreats talk about positive and in some cases even transformative experiences. And as a scientist, I find this extremely compelling, but I also want to bring more data to bear on this. And so we created an evaluation comparing teens who went on the retreats earlier in the summer with those who were intending to go on retreat but didn't enroll until the end of the summer. So it formed this kind of natural group comparison. And both before and after the retreat, the children filled out self-report measures of their mindfulness, their compassion, the depressive symptoms, and so forth. We also assessed working memory through a performance measure called the operation span. You can recall what I mentioned earlier, that mindfulness has this close connection to working memory. And so we thought that this might be one of the cognitive abilities that could be enhanced during meditation and mindfulness training. And then in parallel, parents also filled out measures about their children on indices of self-control and emotional well-being. And just because of time, I want to just quickly walk through these results, but what we can see, oh, apologies, the rendering there didn't fully translate, but compared to the teens who were in the waitlist condition, those who went on the retreat showed increases in parent-reported self-control. They were better able to manage emotional impulses, behavioral impulses. They were better able to delay gratification, according to the parents afterward. Relative to the teens who, again, were in the waitlist condition, those who were on that week-long retreat reported pretty dramatic decreases in depression from before to after the experience. And then, again, apologies for the jarbling there, but the teens who went on retreat showed about a 10 to 11 point increase in working memory capacity following the retreat, whereas the teens who didn't go on it showed pretty much no improvement across time. And so the results of this study show that periods of intense mindfulness practice can be quite feasible for adolescents to do, and they also appear beneficial for things like self-control, for emotion regulation, and so forth. And one of the things that I think is also interesting about this is that just this week-long retreat experience produced some of the same effect sizes that we see with mindfulness training that can go on for weeks and months. And so it's really encouraging to see these results play out over even a short period of training. Obviously, this is the first study of its kind. It's a small sample we need to replicate, but it is exciting in that it does show that teens can learn these capacities and that they can be beneficial. And that moreover, they can be motivated to engage in these practices. And so my time's almost up, so I want to just provide a quick conclusion before turning it over to the next speaker. What I tried to articulate here was kind of a classical view of where mindfulness comes from. It's this view that much of our psychological suffering can be attributed to the way in which we react to discomfort, the way in which we react to pleasure. And that mindfulness can be a useful tool that enables us to become aware of and hopefully ultimately undercut this cycle of reactivity that can lock us into habitual patterns that might not ultimately serve us. And then finally, I want to suggest that when mindfulness is strategically and skillfully deployed, that it can also be a useful tool to help adolescents become aware that their minds are also reactive, right? And that maybe it can be a way for them to improve their capacity for self-regulation. So thank you all very much for your attention.